Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 26 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a household in 18th century Venice. A party is underway to celebrate the betrothal of two young lovers, Clarice and Silvio. The party is interrupted by the arrival of an unknown servant who announces that his master, Federico Rasponi of Turin, has arrived and seeks admittance. There is disbelief and shock on the part of the household because they believe that Federico had recently been killed in a duel. Federico had been engaged to marry Clarice before he was killed, so his unexpected resurrection presents a disconcerting disruption to the new marriage plans. But all is not as it seems, for we will soon discover that the character claiming to be Federico Rasponi is none other than his sister, Beatrice, disguised as a man, come to claim the dowry owed to him, so that she can flee with her lover, Florindo, who, as it happens, was the man who killed her brother in Turin. Confused yet? These events set in train the roundabout farce of Carlo Goldoni's Commedia dell'Arte classic, A Servant to Two Masters. In fact, the destiny of the lovers will largely be determined by the interventions and inventions of the servant, heralded in the play's title, for it is he who finds himself at the very center of the circle of characters as they seek to secure their love and fortune. A Servant to Two Masters was first produced in Italy in about 1746, and though originally it probably consisted of nothing more than a series of outline sketches within which the company of actors would improvise standard comic routines, Goldoni himself eventually drafted an entire script, which has survived to be revived in many translations and adaptations in the centuries since. The play was produced, for example, by the Royal Shakespeare Company back in 1999 in an adaptation written by playwright Lee Hall, whose version is now a set text for A-level drama study in British schools. Hall is himself an acclaimed playwright, of course, and screenwriter, author of plays such as The Pitman Painters and Our Ladies of Perpetual Succor, as well as the screenplays for Billy Elliot and Warhorse. In fact, in the spirit of the play, we couldn't pass up the opportunity ourselves to cover two plays for the price of one in this episode, by also talking today about Richard Bean's One Man Two Guvnors, his hugely popular and hilarious update of Goldoni's original, which the National Theatre produced in 2011 with James Corden in incomparable form as the wily servant. The NT production went on to transfer to the West End and Broadway and was streamed on TV to a global audience for free during lockdown last summer. I'm joined today by an old friend, Justin Greene, who was among the first people in the theatre world that I actually met when I arrived in Britain from Canada quite a few years ago now. Justin is a director, writer, and producer for theatre, television, and radio. He co-wrote with composer Steve Brown the book and lyrics for the musical Spend, 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 which he also directed and which won the Evening Standard, Critics' Circle, and Barclays Theatre Awards for Best Musical. He co-authored with Steve Cook the sci-fi comedy Totally Foxed, an adaptation of Boccaccio's The Decameron for Payne's Plough, and Ludwig and Bertie, a farce about the meeting of Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. As a director, Justin has been associate director at the Leicester Haymarket Theatre and Payne's Plough, and for 4 years was artistic director of the Nuffield Theatre in Southampton. He's directed shows in the West End and in countless theatres around the country. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Douglas.
Thanks for finally giving in to my entreaties to join me on the podcast.
Yes.
When we first talked about doing an episode together, you suggested A Servant to Two Masters. So I'm intrigued to hear where you first came across the play and why you would choose it.
Well, Douglas, did you know that A Servant to Two Masters was the driving force behind Scottish nationalism?
I did not.
And that Nicola Sturgeon might not be in Hollywood today if it weren't for Goldoni's play.
Come on.
Yeah, no, this is true. I first saw the play as a student in Edinburgh in 1977. a few years before we even met. And it was an adaptation by the Scottish actor Victor Carron entitled The Servant o' Twa Meisters. Excuse my terrible Scots accent.
Yeah, don't do that again.
This, in fact, was a revival of a hugely successful and influential production that the great Scottish actor Tom Fleming first directed in 1965. Most significantly, it was in Scottish dialect or Scots dialect or Lowland Scots with a period flavour. And I have to say that despite having lived in Edinburgh as a student for quite some time, I could only understand it in patches. The good burghers of Edinburgh, however, were completely helpless with laughter much of the time. It was a completely rollicking triumph. Now, this original 1965 production was in fact the first production by the resident company in the Royal Lyceum and was part of a spearhead movement for a national theatre of Scotland, and a theatre in Scotland with a very distinct Scottish identity in a European context. And this led to much more drama in Scots dialect. I mean, when I was a student in Edinburgh in the 70s, there was a lot of this kind of stuff. I'm going to risk giving you one more example of my terrible Scottish accent, because it will at least give you an idea of why I find it a struggle to understand exactly what was going on. So this is the Silvio character, or the equivalent. Ye Leon Throbach, gin ye love I only man, it's Anamaka no me. I heard him tell you to you, mind your oath.
Not bad.
Yeah, oh well, thank you. Of course, you have a Scottish wife, so she may well be able to translate some of this.
Yeah, I'm not sure she would recognise that stuff, but...
Yeah, who knows? Anyway, I think you could argue that this was an extremely influential cultural event with reverberations for years to come that led to a heightened Scottish national consciousness. And the effect on me was to make me want to go back to Goldoni's play and find out what the hell had been going on.
Yeah.
So you're asking why I picked the play as well. I mean, I chose the play because of lockdown, basically. It was, I'm pretty sure, early in lockdown that the National Theatre made available for a limited period a video of their absolutely glorious 2011 production of One Man Two Guvnors, which is, of course, as you've said, Richard Bean's version of The Servant of Two Masters. Now, I think this production was possibly the most joyously, gloriously comic and certainly the silliest event in the National Theatre's history. And it was just the most wonderful treat to be reminded of it watching this YouTube video last year. But of course, if you'd never seen the production in the theatre, the video could only be a delightful, but a sort of a reminder of the experience. It wasn't giving you the same thing at all. One Man Two Guvnors was in its essence an event that could only truly be experienced and understood live. It existed in the interaction of the performers and the audience in the moment, in the most extreme way, in which not all theatre does. You know, the theatre, I think, which is more realistic, perhaps it's easy to get a similar experience in a recorded form. But this was the epitome of live performance. No recording could begin to do it any kind of justice. And I think the YouTube video gave us a glimpse of what we were really missing when there was no theatre, and reminded us that theatre is something absolutely that has to happen live.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, because one of the traditions of the whole thing is interaction with an audience, and that is obviously central to all theatre. But in the case of Commedia and this play and One Man Two Guvnors is absolutely essential.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can think of, if you're going to talk about a play, then, what better play than The Servant of Two Masters or One Man Two Guvnors in this context of celebrating what is distinctive about theatre.
Yeah, so I love the idea, though, of your original contact with it in the Scots dialect, because I had read somewhere that Commedia is distinguished in some ways by the physical nature of the theatre. It's full of slapstick and visual jokes. And in fact, I read that one of the reasons for that is that the companies or troupes who were performing it traveled around Italy and Europe to different parts of the country where the language would not necessarily have been understood. So literally, in the same way as you've just described, the audience may or may not have been that au fait with what they were saying, but it didn't matter because what was going on was very visual.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right, Doug, and yeah, we should definitely talk more about that.
Yes, well, before we do, let's talk about Goldoni. Goldoni wrote this back in, as I said, in the mid-18th century. So did you go and research who he is? Do you know about who Goldoni was? I didn't really know much about him.
Well, I had taken an interest in him from that point in the 70s, and I never actually did, but I'd wondered, at various times about reviving a play of his, and I reread recently his memoirs, which certainly do give you an extraordinary flavour of the man. So he was a great Venetian playwright of the 18th century, a poet as well, and a librettist, perhaps both the Alan Ayckbourn and the Tim Rice of his era.
Okay.
So urbane, witty. I mean, I think one of the things that emerges from his memoirs for me is that, if you wanted a dinner companion, you could do no better than Carlo Goldoni, a tremendous urbane wit, knowledgeable about all areas of life. He was a man of the world and a womanizer with some kind of perhaps affinity to the career of Casanova. He was a lawyer, which gave him obviously extensive interaction with all sorts of people and all sorts of conflicts, which fed into his drama. He was born near Venice in 1707, died in Paris when he was given some sort of stipend by he'd been invited by the French royal family, and he was given a stipend by them, and all he basically had to do in those later years was teach the presences. But then, of course, the French Revolution came, and he lost his income, his pension, and I think actually what happened was that the revolutionary government then realized that Goldoni had lost his pension and decided to reinstate it. But by the time they had enacted that, Goldoni was actually already dead and had died in great poverty.
Oh, wow. I have understood that he lived a very colorful life, sort of not unlike some of the characters in his plays, I think. An itinerant, fleeing disputes, scandal. There was one line that said he left Venice at some point to avoid an unwanted marriage. And you think, well, what's behind that one? Lee Hall described his life as assailed by bandits, war, amour fou, penury, and professional catastrophe. He limped around Italy pursuing various adventures, and as you say, ended up in Paris because at one point he was in some kind of dispute with a fellow dramatist about the traditions of Commedia.
Yes, this was Carlo Goldoni.
Yes. So I'm not sure whether that actually led to a threat of a duel or what, but he basically, I think, decided he'd had enough of the critics there in Venice.
I think he became to feel unwelcome, and he was trying to reform Italian theatre, and Goldoni was really attacking him on that basis. I mean, I think the attacks actually were principally very personal, but they were disguised as sort of an artistic rather than a personal difference. And I think Goldoni, easily offended in some respects, felt unwanted in his native country and had the opportunity to work in France.
So I wondered actually where in his life, what were the circumstances in which he came to write this play, A Servant to Two Masters?
Yes, he was basically invited to do so by a great Italian comic actor of the era called Antonio Sacchi, who sent him a French scenario. I mean, again, a kind of Commedia style play. I think that, I'm not sure that there was very much dialogue in this play, but he sent him this play and said, look, we could turn this into a wonderful Commedia comedy. And
starring himself,
of course. And I think he had an idea to it. I don't think this original French play had the idea that there was a servant who had two masters. I think he was saying, why not add that ingredient, the servant who has two masters, to this basic plot with the lovers and so on. And the play that Goldoni wrote was essentially in scenarios. I mean, it was a detailed plot on what was going to happen scene by scene, but I think almost no actual dialogue. And he then sent this scenario back to Saatchi, who then performed it, and wrote to him to tell him it was the most fantastic triumph. But at the time, Goldoni didn't actually get to see the play. It wasn't some years later that he actually got to see it. And as you say, you mentioned earlier that he then wrote the play. I mean, I think this was a constant battle in Goldoni's life between improvisation and written text, and also, you know, his income came to be partially dependent on the published work. You know, people would read his plays, and a lot of his income was coming from that. But he also wanted the play to be set down so that it was less contingent upon individual performances and individual moments of inspiration, but that, you know, he could walk into any town where this play was being performed and feel it was going to be a success.
Well, this is a pretty major step, isn't it? A change in the nature of theater then, in a sense, from improvisation to scripted in that sense. And I guess, as you say, income, I didn't realize that. He may not have, I mean, the idea of licensing royalties by performance was probably not happening at that stage. So any income from publishing would be very welcome.
Yes, I mean, I think it was quite difficult to control, and indeed the publication was quite difficult to control as well, because you would get people printing bootleg versions, and then what he would do was then do an updated version of his and get someone else to print that, so that the other version was out of date.
Boy, that's pretty challenging. You have to stay ahead of the game to keep reinventing your own play. But I think we should talk now a bit about what Commedia dell'Arte is, because we've mentioned this a few times, and I gather that Goldoni has changed, you know, his innovations were based upon some tradition very well established. And what were the characteristics, or what was Commedia dell'Arte?
Well, I mean, we're probably aware of it from the mid-16th century, and it was half-mast figures improvising, and it was touring through Tuscany using stock figures which represented different social classes. I mean, interestingly, there are remnants of Commedia all around us still today, surviving in clown routines and the clown costumes. I don't know if you had this in Canada, but seaside Punch and Judy shows, is that something you're at all familiar with?
Yeah, I know what they are, but not so much until I came to this country, yes.
Well, you know, I still see them periodically. Certainly in my childhood, they were a big thing, and it was a just joyous experience to go and watch a Punch and Judy show. But that figure of Punch is a derivative of the Commedia figure Punchinello, who is a kind of hunchbacked lord of misrule.
I'd love to be called a lord of misrule.
Yes, no, quite, yeah, yes. So there were the servants, who were called zani, and that's where we get the word zany from. Again, you know, we talk about zany comedies, so we see all these historical lines which connect to Commedia, and the chief of the zani was Harlequin in English, or Arlecchino in Italian, and then there were the older merchant class figures, who were Pantaloon or Pantalone, and the doctor or Il Dottore, who was either a lawyer or a medical doctor. And then there were the characters that sort of drove the plot, who were the innamorata, the young lovers. And all these characters wore the same distinctive costumes and masks. And I think some people would argue that these are sort of Jungian archetypes. But I think more banally, one could see that they are the sort of an early Renaissance version of situation comedy characters before the era of television. This early audience could immediately identify the character the moment they walked on stage, and knew all their fundamental traits, and could expect certain behavior patterns, just as, you know, when you and I watch Friends, we know, you know, from the word, well, almost from the word go, certainly from after the first episode, that Joey is the dim-witted womanizer, Monica is the bossy, super competitive perfectionist, and Phoebe unique, eccentric, and has this kind of incredibly wacky way of looking at the world. So our pleasure in watching each episode of Friends is knowing these traits and watching how they play out in this particular episode. And I think Commedia companies got the same advantage and shorthand with their masks and their costumes to take us immediately. You know, they didn't need any setup. They could take you right into the story.
Yes. Well, it's fascinating that you say that they're so recognizable by costume, but also by character, and that therefore people know what to expect and they can then improvise within that. As I understand it as well, it originated as a sort of form of street theater for example, as part of the carnival at Venice, and was performed in outdoor spaces. And as you say, the companies would tour around with all their props and spend some time in a town for a few days until they'd done their trick, and they would then move on. They didn't want it to get too stale. They wanted to come back in a few years' time. And we talked about earlier, it consisted of this visual theater as well. A lot of improvisation, but slapstick, pantomime, visual jokes, some of which they would also be expecting even in the audience.
Yes. I mean, obviously, Italy at that time, there were very different dialects in different areas. So I'm sure that, it couldn't be entirely dialogue dependent. Although I think it is interesting, but, the skill of a Commedia actor lay both in physical agility, incredible acrobatic clowning, but my sense of it is that it also was dependent upon the agility and acrobatics of the mind. They were expected to improvise incredible witty speeches incorporating contemporary events and allusions. I mean, these people were expected to study rhetoric as much as acrobatics, and the performance was intended to be witty, not buffoonery, but witty in every respect. And you could say, I think, that the perfect Commedia actor would be a sort of combination of Stephen Fry or John Sessions with Norman Wisdom or Lee Evans, all those particular skills, and perhaps the kind of skills that we do see in an actor like Steve Martin.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, that sounds like the prototype for pantomime as well in some ways. The idea in pantomime, isn't there, that they are reflecting satire on current events. They refer to the current political events.
Absolutely, yes.
So where they were going, and it may be local, they might refer to local figures and that sort of thing, which the audience would very much recognize.
Absolutely.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the character types and their characteristics and how they're featured in the play we're talking about today as well. You mentioned in Starting Point the Zanni, the Harlequin figure, who in this play is Truffaldino. He's usually, as I understand it, a servant, and he's got some very interesting specific characteristics. One is that he's always hungry. For some reason, food is a primary need to this character. He's also full of contradictions. He's kind of a stupid genius, I think he's being called, because he's not very bright, except that he has a genius for survival. He has a difficulty doing simple tasks, but actually somehow always survives, makes the impossible possible. So there's this contradiction in him, which is fascinating. What is this thing about food, though? Where does that come from?
Well, I think it is pretty important to all of us, isn't it? And of course, we live in a world where obesity is more of a problem than starvation in this country. So I think you have to put this in the context of a servant class, which certainly, if unemployed, didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And I think that when you don't know where the next meal is coming from, then this is not so much greed as wanting to overeat. It's just that you want to eat as much as you can while you have the opportunity to do so. So I think that that's why that character was so important to street theatre. There were so many of the population who related to that.
Well, yes, and in a sense, I guess, I think you were alluding to earlier, is that these characters do reflect the society that they're living in, of course. So in a sort of broad, stereotypical kind of way, but they would recognize these people. So the older men, the vecchi, are they not sort of a wealthier upper class?
Yes.
Some of the ideas to prick the pomposity of those sort of pretensions of those sort of characters.
I mean, the Commedia is an enactment of social conflict in that sense. Yes,
exactly. Actually, this is a good point to say, let's talk a little bit about this play itself and what the plots of a Commedia play is and what the plot of Servant and Two Masters is. I mean, I think, as you say, the same ingredients generally applied. The classic, of course, centered on the innamorati, the lovers, who wish to be married, but, there are obstacles in their way. They're being foiled largely by the older folk who may have some dispute or reasons for them to marry someone else. And it's then also that the Zanni, the servants, play some role in bringing them together somehow.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the innamorati, in Commedia, I think they are a reference to a sort of a more highfalutin drama. So they are almost figures which are kind of pastiches of a more poetic kind of drama which was enjoyed by the upper classes.
Yes. So there's a sort of self-consciousness to this, isn't there? A kind of satire, almost a drama, because they are kind of lovers who are in love with being in love.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So what about the plot of A Servant to Two Masters? I know this is actually incredibly challenging. It's so convoluted.
It is a tough one. I can sort of have a go for people who are listening that did actually get to see either the YouTube or the stage version of One Man Two Guvnors. The plot is essentially the same as that. But I think it's fair to say that in his review in The Guardian, Michael Billington said the plot almost defies description, and I think the only thing I would quarrel with in there is the word almost. I mean, it's mad and complex, and I don't know if I'm right about this, but I have a vague recollection that the skiffle band at one point in One Man Two Guvnors improvises some kind of argument about what on earth had been going on, and if they didn't do that, then they probably should have done. So the play opens with the engagement of Pantaloon's daughter Clarice to Dr. Lombardi's son Silvio. Then the servant Truffaldino arrives to say that Federigo Risponi has arrived and wants to see Pantaloon. Now the big problem is Clarice was engaged previously to Federigo until news came of his death. However, the servant Truffaldino doesn't know that his master is not Federigo and is in fact the sister of the dead Federigo, Beatrice Rasponi, and she's in cross-dressing disguise. Beatrice desperately needs the money owed to the Rasponi family by Pantaloon. Her lover, Florindo, has actually killed her brother Federigo in a duel, and the money will be used to pay the fine and get him off. And she needs to be disguised because women in that period in 18th century Italy can't travel freely. There's no way that she could have gone about this mission if she had not been in male attire. Anyway, unknown to Beatrice, her lover Florindo, fleeing from arrest for murder, has also arrived in Venice, and then the confusions begin to seriously multiply. Truffaldino, like some kind of gig economy worker, takes on a second job as a servant to Florindo, completely ignorant of any connection between Florindo and Federigo.
Or Beatrice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Federigo in inverted commas, and tries to make both his masters believe that he is working solely for them. Now, Beatrice or Federigo makes things a lot worse by taking some almost sadistic pleasure in pretending to woo Clarice, which drives Silvio completely mad with jealousy. And then Truffaldino adds to the confusion by hopelessly mixing up letters to both his masters. He can't read, which doesn't help. And anyway, all's well that ends well in this mad confusion, with the two sets of lovers happily getting together, three sets of lovers if you count the servants, with Truffaldino and Smeraldina as well, and everyone has a happy ending except, unfortunately, poor Federigo, who does remain dead, as dead as the Norwegian blue.
Yes, he was really dead in the beginning. Yeah. You mentioned actually Smeraldina, because there are at least two sets of lovers. There's Clarice and Silvio, and Beatrice and Florindo, but then the servants also get together.
Yes, in the original, of course, the servants get married, but in Richard Bede's version, they go off to Majorca, I think it is, for a fortnight.
Yes, that's right.
As the modern equivalent.
But I think there's some delicious stuff about their recognizing a sort of mutual attraction while all the hoi polloi are going on around them.
Yes, yes.
And Smeraldina, the character, she is also, I gather, one of the stock characters of Commedia.
Yes.
Known as the Columbina. Is that right?
Yes, indeed, yeah. So the Columbina was the female version of the Zani, basically, and a kind of female equivalent of Harlequin. She was extremely intelligent, so not kind of both stupid and intelligent. I think just intelligent, as opposed to Harlequin, who was simple and bright at the same time. She was extremely flirtatious, mischievous, young and attractive, and in the Commedia scenarios, she was often being pursued by Harlequin, or alternatively sometimes attempting to seduce him. So rather like him, she wears a ragged sort of patchwork costume. As she does in The Servant Who Masters, she often does actually end by marrying Harlequin, and often has to spend much of the storyline fighting off the advances of Pantaloon. And
yeah, the older men are always leering after the servant girl.
Exactly, yes. There's a line of hers which does appear in some of the old Commedia scripts that have survived, and she says, "Old men are like trees. When they can bear no more fruit, they're cut down for firewood." So she's someone that takes no nonsense and calls a spade a spade.
Yeah, she's a fantastic character, actually. And as you say, I love the fact that her costume complements the Harlequins. And she's very down to earth. She sees things as they are and calls things as they are. She's possibly one of the most intelligent on the stage, in fact. And that was, I thought, quite interesting in Goldoni's original, that her character, and indeed generally, the play offers interesting representations of women. Obviously, generally, as you mentioned earlier, as a reflection of their time, there wasn't a lot of freedom. I didn't realize they couldn't even travel, but the women's futures and fortunes are certainly completely dependent on decisions being made by men.
Profoundly patriarchal society.
Yeah, and particularly in their securing a beneficial marriage. But the female characters in the play demonstrate an independent intelligence and strength of purpose, I think. I mean, Beatrice's initiative and smarts in her plan to secure the dowry, and Smeraldina herself, they're basically smarter than all the men, aren't they, in the play?
I think they certainly are, and Smeraldina is extremely bright. And
so was he making a statement about women? Was Goldoni making some sort of...
I think that there is a quasi-feminism in Goldoni's script, expressed both by Smeraldina and to some degree in Beatrice as well, actually. And he's led into this by running with the voice of the character. I don't think that he would say that there's anything feminist in his writing or in his philosophy, but he's led that way. And I think this is to do with wanting to find strong appeal in his work to a female audience. In his memoirs, I got this reference to women coming to the theatre, and he seems to say that women come to the theatre to enjoy the plays, but men go to the theatre to see the women. So you get the sense that the female audience is absolutely central to being a box office success.
Interesting.
And I think that definitely influences his characterization of Smeraldina and Beatrice.
I think if you're going to reach out to an audience, if you imagine you're going to reach out to a street audience in a festival square or whatever, then this is the population. This is not...
Yes, half the population are women,
and you want to speak to them and to identify themselves in these plays.
Yes, but I think there's no question that I think some of the things that Smeraldina comes out with would have been profoundly shocking. I mean, there would have been a real frisson in the audience when she comes out with these things. And it would have been an interestingly divisive moment where I think that the men would have in the audience would have been made quite uncomfortable, and the women would have thoroughly enjoyed that.
Be cheering, yes.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, there's a couple of speeches that jumped out at me in that regard. Because she says, she talks about how the men are allowed to follow their desires, their sexual desires, but the women are not.
Yes.
And she goes, oh, yes, a woman's hysterical, but a bloke is full of passion. Whereas I'd be called a slut, you'd be a Jack the Lad. Well, let me tell you, only reason you get to run around like the cock of the midden is because of the unequal economic relations of the sexes. If women had the position in this society equal to their tact, intelligence, and ability to get things done, you don't think they put up with your pouncing around like some superannuated gondolier. I mean, it's a pretty feminist speech, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, and I think... I mean, obviously, that what Lee Hall has done is to bring that right up to date to reflect the current state of conflict between the sexes. It isn't a direct equivalent. I mean, it's certainly that isn't a translation in any obvious way.
So Goldoni would not have been as overt as that?
It just would have been different. I mean, I came across a sort of more literal translation, one of the very early translations by someone called Dent, who translated this play in the 1920s. And the equivalent speech goes, It's, as the old saw says, we get the kicks and you get the halfpence. They say women are unfaithful, but women are committing infidelities all day long. People talk about women and they never say a word about the men. We get all the blame and you are allowed to do as you please. Do you know why? Because it's the men who make the laws. If the women had made them, things would be just the other way around. If I were a queen, I'd make every man who was unfaithful carry a branch of a tree in his hand. And you know what? All the towns would look like forests.
It's a lovely image.
It is. It's a great image, and so it is more to do with the female stereotype of his day, where women are dismissed as sort of deceivers and unfaithful.
Yes.
And it's a defence of the female sex against that accusation, and quite rightly, Lee Hall has brought that right up to date.
There's some other elements that I thought are wonderful about the play, and as expressed as well in One Man Two Guvnors, which is to do with the theatricality of it, the sort of comic set pieces.
Yes.
So, I mean, the classic one at the center is the famous dinner where the servant, Truffaldino, or in One Man Two Guvnors, Francis, has to organize to feed, to wait on both Beatrice in one room and Florindo in the other. They're in the same hotel. They don't know they're in the same hotel. They're looking for each other, but they don't know they're there. He's serving both of them, and they're both having a meal simultaneously, and he's moving between them, trying to serve them. But also he's, of course, as you said earlier, he's desperate to eat as well. So he's stealing food from the plates as they come out, and he's delivering them, and he gets very confused as to whose plate is for whom and all that kind of thing. It's classic farce setup, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's lots of brilliantly constructed farcical moments, and that is one of the best. I mean, one of the ones which certainly springs to my mind is the wonderful argument in One Man Two Guvnors, where James Corden has this row with himself.
Yes.
And actually a physical fight. And again, it's just achingly funny and brilliantly constructed. These things are all very difficult to achieve and have to be extremely carefully planned. And in One Man Two Guvnors, there's a lot of audience participation. I don't think particularly audience participation in quite this way would have been a feature of the original Commedia, although there was an interaction between audience and performer. I'm sure of that.
I was going to ask you about that, Justin, because in the text, there are a lot of asides that characters do speak directly to the audience in a sort of conspiratorial way.
So that gives it something of the flavour of the audience participation. I think one of the differences is that Goldoni's plays are for theatrical buildings. That a lot of things change the moment that you put things onto a stage. So there's no obvious equivalent in street theatre. It's not quite the same thing. Bringing somebody up from out of the audience is a bigger device. It makes more impact than just moving round somebody in the street and talking to them. But of course, traditional English pantomime always has moments when children or other members of the audience are brought up on stage, and One Man Two Guvnors decides very much to use the conventions of pantomime. It also uses the device of plants in the audience.
Yes.
Which is quite interesting, because obviously at one moment James Corden, Francis, as he's called, the Truffaldino character, does interact with the audience and talk to them. But on other occasions, he then talks to a member of the audience who is actually a plant.
Yes.
There's the section where a member of the audience apparently produces a hummus sandwich.
Yes.
And apparently James Corden then improvises brilliantly on the subject of hummus.
Yes, but she's also then, I recall being completely taken in by this, because she's also then pulled up onto stage.
Well, the genius of this is that they first interact with real members of the audience, they then interact with a plant, they then interact with another plant. So the guy with the hummus sandwich is not the woman who is later brought up on stage, and which is all very carefully constructed, and it was so effective. I had a look the other day at some of the original press notices of One Man Two Guvnors, and the critic for the Sunday Times, I think it is, actually refers to the hummus sandwich incident and says, just on that particular night, there happened to be this guy with a hummus sandwich, and James Corden just came out with this unbelievably clever stuff. So he fell for it.
I fell for the plant, definitely. So, as you say, very cleverly done, because he invites two men earlier on to come up and help him move a trunk. And that's all fine.
Just on the subject of the trunk, and of course, the people that move the trunk are genuine members of the audience, as you say. I don't know if you know this, but when the play was performed in New York and James Corden is looking for people to bring up on stage for the trunk carrying, do you know who he picks on?
Oh, was this Donald Trump?
Donald Trump, yes.
But yeah, that's a great coup. I think the one with the second plant, she ends up being brought up on the stage to help in the dinner scene, moving stuff back and forth. And in the end, she actually gets doused by a fire extinguisher.
Yes.
Because there's some catastrophes happening on the dining table, set on fire and things. And you're just going, how could this possibly happen to this innocent person in the audience? I was completely sucked in.
Oh, well, interestingly, because I sort of wondered whether that was a moment when it was so extreme that there was almost a wink to the audience that they had been taken in, but they need be taken in no longer. But obviously not in your case.
No, I'm just completely gullible. I'm the perfect audience. I wanted to talk to you a bit about the themes of Commedia, and we talked about the food. And one of the reasons that food is such a common element is, as you said, reflects the society in which they lived and their basic need for that. And in fact, the themes are generally a reflection of our most basic desires.
Yes.
Food, love, money, sex. So, in this play, money, for example, there's a running theme there that because when Beatrice arrives dressed as Federico and reappears, Pantaloon decides to honor his first arrangement with Federico at the expense of Clarice and Silvio's desire to marry for romantic love, because he had some kind of financial interest in doing so. They have business interests, and that supersedes the romantic interest. So there's some element, isn't there, through the play? And of course, Beatrice has come to secure the dowry. But I mean, is the point somehow that is Goldoni satirizing the primacy of money, that we put financial things before romantic?
I don't think he does. I mean, I think interestingly, I think that was probably more in the Commedia that he was rebelling against, actually. I mean, I think that the Pantalone of Goldoni's play is not so driven by money. He understands the importance of money and values it, of course, but he definitely wants the happiness of his daughter. So I think he is bound by the law rather than greed. And I think that the character in Commedia had become very crudely miserly over time, but the Pantaloon of Goldoni's play is not a miser. He is very ready to pay his debt.
Right.
And wants to be seen to be dealing honourably in relation to commerce. And of course, the world of Venice of this time is entirely built on trade.
Yes.
And the values of trade. And Goldoni was a diplomat defending the trade interests of Venice. He understands all this absolutely. So I think he actually has a more respectful attitude to Pantaloon.
Okay. He's not a critic of capitalism per se, then.
I think interestingly, I think he can be led that way every now and again when he is led by the voice and consciousness of his character. But no, I think that when he is expressing his own views, he is actually very much attempting to support the status quo of his society.
I wonder whether that's the same in One Man Two Guvnors. There's slight changes and nuances, aren't there, in the way One Man Two Guvnors translates from the original. And Richard Bean is obviously, as you said at the very beginning, that it's the plot and the characters are virtually the same. In fact, in the printed text of One Man Two Guvnors, his cast list indicates their equivalents in the Goldoni original.
Yes.
But there are, of course, changes. Then it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about how faithful he was to the original intent of Commedia and Goldoni's play in updating One Man Two Guvnors to 1960s Brighton. What do you think?
Well, I think this is a very interesting point. I mean, I think he uses Goldoni's play as inspiration. He does keep elements of the characters and the structure of the plot. But Richard Bean's focus is very clearly on making something hugely entertaining for today's audience in the spirit of the original. I don't think that you can see this as an attempt to slavishly recreate Goldoni for the audience, but to do something in a similar vein. I mean, he throws off the shackles of academia, and it is wonderfully successful. And there's a number of interesting decisions that he and Nick Heitner make about their setting. And there's, first of all, of course, he sets it in Brighton, and secondly, in 1963, of all years. So Brighton, for me, immediately conjures up the world of the dirty weekend and the rude postcard, and the place where Londoners throng to on bank holidays and where the sun is supposed to be shining but possibly never is. But it helps to set the mood of the play.
It was also somewhere, as you say, where people went to legally commit adultery, wasn't it? They had to go to Brighton to be caught out. And
yes, absolutely.
And there's also that sort of criminal underworld of Brighton Rock, Graham Greene's Brighton Rock. So although it's not as really nasty as that, it's more like a carry-on criminality going on, isn't there?
Yes, I mean, I think indeed that Nick Heitner did say that he mentioned carry-on films right at the start to Richard Bean, and you can certainly see that. It's an untroubled, sort of optimistic early 60s, an innocent but sexy era, perhaps.
Yeah.
It is quite interesting that he specifically quotes the year 1963. I don't know if you've sort of wondered about why he picks 1963.
Philip Larkin.
Yeah, I'm sure it's Larkin. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. And the poem, of course, concludes, so life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP.
No, and in fact, actually, wasn't there a reference somewhere? Don't they say that Rachel in disguise as Roscoe is supposed to look a bit like a young Ringo Starr? Yeah.
Yeah, no, there is a reference to that as well, yes. It was also, of course, in terms of criminality, it was also the heyday of the Cray twins. And I wonder whether, the connection between the brother and sister and twin-like similarity was something in Richard Bean's mind. And the Crays certainly did like to go down to Brighton a lot. I think the older brother, Charlie, lived somewhere close to Brighton. They spent a lot of time there.
I was going to say, though, that we're talking about what he sets it in is a kind of lower life criminal underworld. And I think there is slightly different, isn't it? Because are there any upper class characters in One Man Two Guvnors, as there were? The Vecchi in the Commedia are generally professional class.
I think Beatrice and Florindo are sort of upper class characters, basically, in Goldoni. And actually, it is quite interesting. But yes, the whole low life setting. I mean, one of the reasons you can see why he's led to that, because when he's updating it, he needs there to be weapons around. This needs to be a world in which Federico or Roscoe, as Richard Bean calls him, has been killed in a fight. And he needs the moment when Rachel, disguised as Roscoe, can produce a knife and threaten the Silvio Allen character.
Yes. Well, he does retain all sorts of elements of it. The plot mainly is as per. And there's the physical humor and the improvisation we've talked about, how that, he creates those opportunities, albeit well set up. And there's some fantastic slapstick. I mean, I was crying with laughter, really, when they have the very old waiter.
Yes.
Who's part of the crew serving the two diners. He's virtually 100 years old, and he repeatedly falls backwards down the open stairwell in the hotel.
It is absolutely brilliant clowning. I mean, there are the fact that he doesn't actually break every bone in his body as he falls down the stairs is just astonishing skill, for one thing. And then, of course, he also has terrible shakes and has to carry a tureen of soup.
Yes.
And then the final addition to all this is that he has a pacemaker which he can turn up and suddenly, as a result, move at 4 times his normal speed.
Yes. As you said earlier, you alluded earlier, he's basically an acrobat, isn't he?
Yes, yeah. And that is, I mean, that unquestionably is true to the spirit of Commedia, and it still delights an audience.
I think one of the other features that I thought was really interesting is that the way we identify with Truffaldino or with Francis in One Man Two Guvnors, the servant character. He is the little man, is the hero of the show, isn't he? He's an everyman. It's a chance for ordinary people to identify with the servant character and his desire for his next meal, to earn a bit of money, find sex, or even love. Richard Bean said somewhere that we all pull for Francis, that we're on his side.
Yes, and that's obviously a lot to do with the way there's a lot of ingredients in the success of it in the One Man Two Guvnors, and James Corden's performance is masterly in that respect. I mean, he has the extraordinary ability to engage the audience. I mean, he's just the most likable performer.
Yes, I've found the quote here. Richard Bean said, "Francis is every man. He's us on stage, and although he's stupid, he is not evil, and we root for him."
Yes, and that is certainly absolutely characteristic of Harlequin or Arlecchino. It is the fact that he is a character without malice. Whatever mischief is going on, he is completely without malice.
That's very attractive, isn't it? I was going to ask you, why is Goldoni, this play or this form of theatre, still worth reviving?
Well, I think sort of in a sense, we have already answered that in the course of the discussion. You see the huge impact that the Scottish version of The Servant Two Martyrs made in 1965 and then in 1977, and the enormous impact of the NT's revival, which goes on to be a triumph on Broadway. And, Goldoni is a man who wrote 200 plays, 150 of them comedies. I don't think even A Servant of Two Masters was the most successful in his lifetime. I mean, this is the most incredible, rich resource of material. And I don't think we have to see reviving Goldoni or adaptations as some kind of dry academic exercise. I don't think we are trying to reconstruct Goldoni in that kind of spirit, but he offers us this wonderful theatrical resource and tradition, and we should go out of our way to exploit it. I'm sure among those 150 comedies there are other theatrical gems waiting to be recut and polished up by contemporary directors and adapters.
Interesting idea. I was also thinking that one of the things is that it's so accessible to us as well, is that these common ingredients of things like farce, we talked about the dinner scene. It seems to me like you can imagine any classic farcical scene with the doors slamming and hiding in cupboards and the whole thing.
Yes,
is all there in that scene.
Yeah, some of these devices are completely timeless, and that's the extraordinary thing, is that he sets up this basic scenario for the dinner scene, and it can be played out in all sorts of different ways with all sorts of different gags. This is somebody who understands the theatre so well, so he understands how to set up a structure which can then be used in innumerable different ways.
Yes. I also think there's a kind of energy to this as well, and a kind of very open and conscious acknowledgement that this is theater, and that we're engaged in it on an equal basis with an audience, right? We talked about the participation or the communication with the audience before, but also the nature of what he's presenting. It's a very explicit aim to entertain, isn't it? You're just reveling in that, the artifice of the theater, of the simulation of the sight gags, of the broad social satire. This is the height of accessibility.
Yes, it is absolutely the height of accessibility. I think one of the interesting things is that the fact that there is a connection with Goldoni and the 18th century and classic theatre is also part of our experience, even when watching quite a radical adaptation or version or a new play based on by Richard Bean in One Man Two Guvnors. I mean, there are one or two knowing references to Commedia in his play, where he says, of course, you guys in the audience who know all about Commedia, you're expecting me to do this, etc., etc. And I think one of the things that does, and the fact that indeed it's the National Theatre presenting it, is to say this is both a cultural event, it is both a kind of academic exercise, and also at the same time it is incredibly entertaining contemporary theatre. And yet you do wonder whether, if Richard Bean had written this play and there was no reference to Commedia, the reference to Goldoni was entirely removed and this was a new play, I don't think we would have responded to it in quite the same way. I think the cultural context is important, and indeed perhaps that cultural context is also what makes it so successful on Broadway. You know, that American audience is saying, we're not only having the most fabulous time, we are showing how clever and learned we are.
Yes.
By enjoying this thing which emerges from the Venetian 18th century.
Well, it works on two levels there, doesn't it? Because there'll be some portion of the audience where that won't mean anything. But to us who are fancy ourselves as literary, whatever, we're going, oh, yes, isn't it? And we're in the National Theatre, and that's why it's on the National Theatre stage. So that's really cleverly observed. We talked earlier about the themes a bit, about how these characters are all recognizably human as well. I mean, they're stereotypical, but they also reflect ordinary desires that we all have in a sort of naked form, really, for love and money and sex and food in particular. And also the kind of reflections on social class, all that still pertains. And in fact, I guess the fact that One Man, Two Guvnors was done, that it could be updated to brighten and all those character types be recognizable, shows that they endure, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, it's a very different exercise from reviving Shakespeare, because, you know, there the text is sacrosanct, almost.
Yes.
Any revival of Shakespeare needs to keep the language. That is the essence of it. But with Goldoni, what we're saying is that the essence of it is a theatrical structure.
And that's exactly what he intended when they went, and where it came from, right? That's the way they were written. It was a structure, and then there was all this openness within it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it only became something beyond structure as he started to write the plays down for publication. For him, you know, these are blueprints for performance. They aren't sacred texts.
Well, it's fantastic that it's come down to us. So it's just as well that he did write it down.
So I don't know if we have time for this, but perhaps I could just finish up with a wonderful tribute that Robert Browning wrote about Goldoni on the occasion of a statue to Goldoni being erected in Campo Santo Bartolomeo in Venice.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Browning wrote, Goldoni, good, gay, sunniest of souls, glassing half Venice in that verse of thine. What though it just reflect the shade and shine of common life, nor render, as it rolls, grandeur and gloom, sufficient for thy shoals, was carnival. Perini's deaths enshrine secrets unsuited to that opaline surface of things, which laughs along thy scrolls. There throng the people, how they come and go, lisp the soft language, flaunt the bright garb, see on piazza, calle, under portico and over bridge, dear king of comedy, be honoured, thou that didst love Venice so, Venice and we who love her all love thee.
Ah, lovely. It's like if you don't love Venice, you don't love Goldoni, and everybody loves Venice, surely.
And the sense of him, you know, capturing the life of an entire city.
Yeah, and the people thronging to it. Right, so I come to the traditional point in our podcast, Justin, where I ask my guests to recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. So I know you have a long career in the theater, so I'm really intrigued to know what you might nominate as a personal favorite that we could do.
Well, that's a tough one for a theatre director, but I think I'd like to recommend a play to your listeners that they are less likely to be already familiar with. That is Gas by George Kaiser. I first saw this play in the 1970s, and even before I first saw a Servant of Two Masters at a student drama festival. And although it was a student production, it opened my eyes to what theatre can uniquely do. It was visually inspired by Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and this is one of the great German expressionist plays, first performed in 1918. It explores the tensions between the individual and technology, and deals with the danger in naively believing that advances in technology will inevitably benefit mankind. There are workers in a factory producing gas which all the world is entirely dependent upon for its energy, and these workers are being reduced to automatons. And I think in the hands of the right adapter and director could speak to our age.
Sounds really interesting in terms of topicality, but also I'm starting to imagine an expressionist visual treat as well.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Thank you for that, because I don't know that. And what I love about doing this podcast, one of the things is to be introduced to new plays and new writers. So thank you for that. And thank you, Justin, for joining me to talk about A Servant to Two Masters. This has been delightful and really appreciate it.
It's been very enjoyable. Thank you so much, Doug.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
Take care.
As the curtain falls, or more accurately, as the troupe depart the piazza and we stroll home, what do we take with us? The warm glow from having laughed until tears leaked from our eyes, of having seen the men of power foiled in their arrogant ambitions, the lovers united, and our hero, the little man, having survived to feed another day. It is the affirmation of humanity that we feel when players on the stage reach across to embrace us in the audience, to create a moment of shared entertainment and experience. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.